In the blinding snows of Wyoming, a mother carries her child through fire and blood, hunted by a zealot bent on sacrificing the infant to an ancient cult. But fate is not only shaped by man, it's carved in blood-soaked hooves, the gaze of a returning soul, and a flame that never dies. Subscribe now so you won't miss the upcoming episodes that strike deep into your soul. Under the steel-gray sky of a Wyoming winter, the wind howled like a wounded beast. It tore across the plains with a violence that bent trees and split silence open like bone beneath a blade. Snow swirled in relentless spirals, each flake a shard of ice carried on a furious wind, crashing against the land without mercy. The sun was only a pale smear behind a veil of clouds, casting no warmth, only a colorless morning. Emily Grace knelt in the snow, her knees buried in white that was already stained with red. The red wasn't hers. Her hands shook as she pressed them against James's chest. But she had known the moment the bullet tore through him that it was over. His eyes were still open, glassy, and fixed skyward, as if they could follow the smoke rising from their burning home behind her. Smoke that hissed against the snow, a dark crawling ghost that clung to the edges of the world they'd built together. The forge, their forge, now engulfed in flame. The fire popped and cracked behind her, throwing shadows that danced across the blood on her hands. She didn't look back at it. She couldn't. The roar of it was enough. It sounded too much like laughter. The baby cried, a high, sharp sound of pure life, piercing the wind. Emily turned slowly mechanical, as if her bones were no longer hers. Lily. She had almost forgotten, and the guilt that struck her chest nearly dropped her beside her husband's body. Her legs refused her. She stumbled, crawled. The baby lay wrapped in a thin wool blanket tucked into a wicker basket already rimmed with frost. Her small face was red from crying, her lips quivering from the cold. Emily reached in and pulled the baby to her chest, folding her coat around the child, but the coat was soaked in blood and ash. It offered nothing but grief. Lily's tiny fists flailed against Emily's neck as she rocked her, whispering sounds that weren't words. Her own voice came out hoarse, too broken to form sentences. All she could manage was sound rhythm, the shape of comfort. Shh, Mama's here. Mama's got you. But she didn't. She didn't have anything. The men who came bandits, maybe hired hands, more likely hadn't taken their time. They'd been in and out like lightning, leaving ruin in their wake. They didn't even rob the place. They weren't after money. They were after destruction, precision, message. A house burned from the inside. A man shot in the back while shielding his daughter's crib. They were sending a message to her, or maybe to James. Emily's gaze drifted back to him again. The snow was already covering his body, flurries piling up in his beard, clinging to the strands of dark brown hair that had fallen across his forehead. He looked peaceful, and that made her want to scream. He had promised her peace. He had promised her this land, this forge, this fire, that together they would carve a life into this cruel, sharp wilderness, that their daughter would never know the violence they had known. It took only minutes for everything to be taken. The forge crackled louder. She could smell the iron warping the leather, burning the cedar beams, snapping as heat cracked their ribs. The wind pulled her hair into her face, but she didn't brush it back. She rocked Lily with both arms, trying to preserve whatever warmth she had left. A sudden gust lifted the corner of James's coat. Something slipped from the inner pocket and landed in the snow with a dull thump. Emily didn't move for it. Not at first. Her mind was still in shards, her breath caught in her throat. But something, a flicker, a pull, a thread of instinct made her shift her weight and crawl toward it, still holding Lily tight to her chest. It was a folded piece of thick parchment, a map. The paper was aged and frayed at the edges. Its ink faded, but not erased. Curves of topography sketched landmarks, strange symbols along a ridgeline she didn't recognize. At the bottom, in James's blocky handwriting, just 3 words, "The Ember knows." Her fingers trembled over the phrase, not from the cold. James had told her stories, whispered them when the nights were longest and the fire low. Of an ancient flame that never died, hidden deep in the wilds beyond the Rockies. A sacred fire. A light that knew the truth of every soul that approached it. She had thought them just stories. But he believed. He had always believed. And now he was dead. A scream built in her chest, but never made it to her lips. Instead, she folded the map, tucked it deep inside her blouse, pressed Lily closer. The wind howled louder. The baby cried harder. Behind them, the forge collapsed. A roar of wood and flame crashing in a final exhale, a beast devouring itself. The snow flared orange in the glow. Emily stood. She did not know where she was going. She did not know how far she would get, but there was no other choice. She looked at James one last time. Snow was already burying him. By morning, he'd be just another drift on the prairie. Her legs burned with every step, her boots sinking into the white, the cold slicing through her dress like paper. Lily's cries grew quieter. That terrified her more than the cold. The wind wrapped around them like a serpent. It shrieked against her skin, clawed at her cheeks. But she didn't stop. Emily Grace walked into the storm, a mother carrying her daughter, a map pressed to her heart. The fire in the forge behind them flickered once more and died. But somewhere deep in the uncharted wilderness, the embers still burned. And maybe, just maybe, it was waiting, under a sky that bled ash and silence. Emily Grace stumbled through a corridor of snow and wind, her legs dragging her breath, coming in hoarse bursts that froze the moment they left her lips. The child in her arms, Lily, had grown too quiet. That silence stabbed sharper than any blade. Each of Emily's steps sank deeper than the last, as if the earth itself wanted to claim her alongside the man she had buried in her heart just hours before. The cold was more than cold now. It had turned into something personal, something cruel. It slithered beneath her coat, into the crevices of her fingers, beneath her tongue, inside her bones. Her toes no longer existed, just stones in wet cloth. Her feet were bleeding. She didn't know when that had started, only that her legs were shaking, her vision doubling. Her arms cradled Lily like a shield of flesh, but she knew. If she fell, if she stopped, it would be over. Somewhere behind her, the smoldering memory of the forge collapsed under its own weight, and with it, the past. James, the life they built, the sound of hammer on iron, the smell of steel cooling on an anvil, all of it eaten by fire and wind. Emily's knees buckled. She hit the snow hard, crumpling like parchment. Lily whimpered weakly against her chest. Emily tried to rise, but her legs refused. Her hands clawed at the white around her, searching for something, anything solid. Nothing. She laid her cheek against the snow. It didn't feel cold anymore. That frightened her. She closed her eyes and tried to picture something warm, a candle. A sunbeam on James's face, her daughter's first smile. But everything was going gray, her mind breaking apart like glass under a hammer. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Hoofbeats, soft at first like echoes through the fog of memory. Then louder, heavier. The kind of rhythm that carried weight, that carried purpose. She opened her eyes, couldn't move her neck. Only her gaze shifted. At first she thought it was a shadow cut into the snow, a mistake of perception. But it grew closer. Through the curtain of falling snow came a shape-tall, lean breath steaming from flared nostrils, each step measured. A horse, black as obsidian save for a thin ribbon of silver along its flank. It moved not with fear, not like a wild animal sensing threat, but like a sentinel. A guardian. Emily blinked slowly. The horse stopped just a few feet away. It was bleeding. There on its shoulder, an angry gash streaked red down its flank. The wound steamed against the cold, staining the snow beneath it. But it stood tall, proud, its eyes wide and burning with something that wasn't just instinct found her in the white. Those eyes, they were not James's. But something in them knew her. The horse didn't move at first. It just watched. Emily couldn't speak. Her lips cracked when she tried. Blood on her teeth. All she managed was a whisper. James. The name came out barely audible, a breath more than a word. But the horse's ears flicked toward her, and then, graceful as breath, it stepped forward. It lowered its head, carefully. Snow melted from its muzzle as it exhaled, nostrils flaring near her hand. Then it touched her. Its forehead brushed the back of her fingers, where they lay in the snow. Emily's vision flickered. The cold rushed in again, black and final. Then nothing. Silence. She woke to motion, not fast, not jarring. Gentle like drifting in a cradle made of breath and memory. Her arms were still around Lily. The child was warm. Emily opened her eyes to darkness, and snow sweeping past her vision stars, far above, spinning slowly. She was lying across the broad back of the black horse. Its coat, despite the blood, was warm beneath her. She felt the weight of her daughter resting against her chest, swaddled tight inside her coat. The horse moved with purpose. Each step was deliberate, confident. They were ascending. Beneath them, Emily saw snow-strewn slopes sliding past. Cliffs. Trees like black claws reaching upward. The horse climbed as if it had been here before, as if it knew every rock, every patch of snow crusted with hidden ice. She wanted to speak, but her throat refused. Instead, she looked ahead. Far in the distance, above the tallest ridge, was a faint glow. Not the fire of destruction, not the hungry red of her burning forge. This was different. A pulse of crimson, like a heart beating behind the mountain. A low, steady thrum in the sky. a warmth her skin remembered, even if her mind doubted. The ember? She didn't know how she knew, but she did. The map pressed to her chest had spoken of it. James had whispered its name when she thought he was dreaming. The ember knows he'd said one night when Lily was still growing in her womb. It remembers what the world forgets. Now she saw it glowing like a beacon. The horse made no sound but breath. No reins, no saddle. Nothing bound it to her, and yet it carried her, past the dead trees, past the drift-covered rocks, through canyons that had not seen humans in decades. It walked for hours. Sometimes it stopped letting her sleep in fragments. Every time she opened her eyes, the red glow was closer. Sometimes it flickered, sometimes it faded, but it was always there. The horse never hesitated. She began to think maybe it wasn't real, that perhaps she had died in the snow, and this was her afterlife, a slow ride through the dream of a world that could have been. But then Lily stirred. She mewed softly against Emily's chest, her fingers curling around the button of Emily's coat. Warm breath puffed from her lips, fogging the fur-lined collar. Alive, still alive. And suddenly the pain came rushing back, the cold in her toes, the stiffness in her spine, the sting of the gash on her ankle where the ice had sliced through her boot. She was still bleeding, still broken, but not dead. The horse climbed higher. Its wound no longer bled, but she could see the stiffness in its shoulder. It limped occasionally, favoring its right foreleg. Yet it kept moving stubborn in its silence. Once as they crossed a narrow ledge, carved into a cliffside, the wind rose to a scream. Emily pressed herself over Lily, fearing the child would be swept from her arms. Her nails dug into the horse's hide, not to hurt, but to hold on. The horse turned its head, just slightly. Its eyes met hers again, and for a heartbeat, Emily forgot the cold. She saw something in those eyes. Familiarity, yes, but also grief. Echoes of pain, recognition. Not of her, perhaps, but of her sorrow. It knew, maybe not who she was, but what she carried. She reached one hand forward, brushing her fingers along the side of its neck. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice a rasp. The horse said nothing, only stepped forward into the wind, toward the ember's glow. By the time the horizon began to pale with the first hints of morning, the mountain had changed. The trees were sparser now, the snow thinner, the wind quieter. Even the silence had shifted. It no longer pressed against her ears like a weight. It felt expectant. Listening, Emily lifted her head and looked forward. They had reached a plateau. The sky overhead was beginning to turn lavender, then indigo, then the first streaks of rose. A sunrise coming to a place that had known only shadow. And in the distance closer, now much closer, was the glow. No longer a flicker. It pulsed like a heartbeat, like breath. The ember. Emily felt something shift in her chest. A tightness giving way to ache. Her arms tightened around her daughter. She could feel Lily breathing steadily, calmly. Alive. She looked at the horse again, at the dried blood on its flank, at the wild, intelligent eyes, still focused ahead. Then she whispered again, softer this time. "James." The horse did not react, but it didn't need to. The wind shifted, brushing Emily's hair across her face like a caress. And for the first time since the world ended, she didn't feel alone. Under the collapsing roof of what was once St. Augustine's chapel, the last remnant of sunlight vanished behind black storm clouds. Dust hung in the air like ash, filtering through broken stained glass windows, pieces of saints and angels scattered in blood-colored light across rotting pews. The silence inside was not peaceful. It was loaded. Waiting. Stale with old rituals and something far older than scripture. The altar was no longer a place of prayer. It was a slab of polished stone, cold and dark and wrong. Sheriff Dax stood at its edge, the collar of his black coat stiff around his throat, a blood-stained cloth wrapped around one wrist. His fingers were slick with something fresh crimson, still warm. Across from him, kneeling on one knee, was a man cloaked in tattered ecclesiastical robes. The remnants of a cassock clung to his frame, like discarded skin. Father Cormac's head was bowed, hands folded, not in reverence, but in invocation. He whispered in a language older than the walls, older than any book men were meant to read. "Dominus, ex tenebris, aperi portam." The sheriff's lips barely moved, louder. The priest lifted his face, what remained of it. His eyes were cataracts of yellow. His mouth opened unnaturally wide to continue the chant. "Per sanguinem innocentium, sanguinem ortum, aperi." The blood in the brass bowl trembled. A breeze curled through the room, not from outside, but inward, down from the rafters, down from the shadows. Candles aligned around the altar flickered in unnatural rhythm, though no wind touched them. Their flames twisted, spiraled, breathed. At the center of the altar, carved into the stone, was a symbol, a jagged spiral flanked by a crescent and an eye. The flame in the bowl reflected this spiral. Dax's hand hovered over the brass. He lowered it slowly into the bowl and dragged 2 fingers through the blood. "Will it open?" he asked. The priest kept chanting, "Tell me it will open." Father Cormac's voice rasped, "Only with the blood of the newly born. Only with the pure." The sheriff's jaw flexed. His eyes ice blue and razor-hard, fixed on the flame that refused to go out. He stared into it, as if daring it to burn him. "It should have gone out," he muttered. "It hasn't," the priest said. "She still breathes." Dax turned on his heel. The chapel door groaned in protest as he flung it open. Outside, snow fell in horizontal waves. The storm clawed at his coat, but he didn't flinch. Behind him, the flame on the altar danced higher. The blood in the bowl began to bubble. He walked down the cracked stone steps into the snow, where 3 men waited, hooded, mounted, their faces hidden beneath frost and fabric. One of them handed him a folded telegram. His gloves creaked as he opened it. "Survivor spotted near Black Ridge. Female, infant in arms." Beneath that, scrawled hastily, "Horse trail, heading north toward the frost teeth." His breath hissed through his nose, steam rising like smoke. "She should be dead," he whispered. "She was meant to die." The first rider leaned forward slightly. "Should we finish the job?" Dax looked up slowly. His face was a sculpture of fury carved in cold. His skin pale beneath the stubble twitched near his cheekbone. A nerve fired. His eyes twitched toward the chapel behind him, toward the flame still burning against the cold. "The ritual is incomplete," he said. The riders shifted uneasily. One crossed himself. Another spat into the snow. "It's just a woman and a baby," the youngest one muttered. "How the hell does that stop?" Dax grabbed him by the coat, yanked him down from the saddle like a rag doll, and pressed the telegram to his face. "She isn't just anything." The man hit the ground hard. Snow puffed beneath him. He stayed down, eyes wide. Dax turned to the others. "She carries more than a child," he said. "She carries interruption. Ruin." That woman refused the plan. She took what was promised and walked into the fire. He reached inside his coat and withdrew a silver object, half cross, half blade. She chose to survive. A silence descended among them, deeper than the snow, thicker than the wind. The riders stared at the object in Dax's hand. It pulsed faintly in the stormlight. "Her blood," he continued, "is stained. But the child..." He let the word hang in the air like bait. "The child is pure." Behind him, the chapel groaned. A moan from deep within the walls. He didn't flinch. He only looked east. "She's heading toward Ember Ridge," he said flatly. "She thinks she can make it." One of the riders whispered, "That place doesn't exist." Dax looked at him like a man considers something beneath his boot. "Then you have no excuse to fail." He mounted his horse in one smooth motion, face unreadable, but his eyes were already aflame. "Find her," he growled. "Bring me the child. Burn everything else." Inside the chapel, the flame refused to die. Cormac stared into it, lips moving without sound now. His hands trembled. He could feel it, the tremor beneath the world, the beating heart that only throbbed when the veil between things grew thin. The ember knew, but what it knew did not serve men like Dax. The old priest's mouth twisted, cracking at the corners. He whispered into the candle's glow, "Et ignis meminit," and in the blood, something began to stir. Night fell like a shroud over the mountains. Wind stalked through the granite hollows, howling in long, low moans that sounded too much like voices. Emily could no longer tell if they were real or echoes in her head. She was freezing again. The fire inside her, whatever had driven her up that ridge, whatever had kept her alive on the back of the black horse, was flickering, dying. Her breath came in bursts. Her vision doubled. Midnight's gait had slowed. The stallion was limping, shoulders damp with blood, steam rising from his wound. But he didn't stop. They reached a ravine cut deep into the rock, half hidden behind a veil of frost-laced pine. A place the map hadn't marked. A place untouched by even the wind's reach. And there, nestled into the earth, like it had grown from it, stood a crooked shack of stone and timber, smoke rising thinly from its chimney-orange light, flickering through a single cracked window. Emily had no idea how the horse had found it. She slid from the saddle with the last of her strength knees buckling as she hit the frozen ground. She curled over Lily, shielding the baby with her body as her teeth chattered in a rhythm she couldn't stop. Her ears roared. Her limbs stung, then went numb. The door opened before she could call for help. A figure emerged, lean, slow-bent, with years. The man walked with a long stick, groping the ground with the ease of someone who didn't need eyes to see. His hair hung in pale gray strands, his beard even longer. His coat was stitched from hides that hadn't been worn in decades. He moved like he'd come from the mountain itself. He stopped a few feet from her and tilted his head. "I smell steel," the man said. His voice was rough but not unkind. Emily tried to answer. What came out was a gasp. He moved forward. The stick tapped against her boot, then her arm. He crouched. "There you are," he murmured. His hand brushed her face. Gnarled fingers, rough skin, but gentle. He paused when they touched the baby wrapped in her coat. She felt his breath hitch. Another one. Then, without another word, he lifted her with a strength that didn't belong to his frame. She cried out more from instinct than pain. Her body had no voice left. Midnight snorted behind her, pawing the earth once before collapsing to his knees. The man turned his head. "You too," he said quietly. "Of course you came back." Inside the cabin, time stopped. The heat from the stone hearth was immediate, but it didn't feel safe. It felt like crossing from death into something that hadn't decided whether to keep you. The man laid Emily on a cot lined with old furs. He took Lily from her arms with care, not speaking, not questioning, just moving with the certainty of someone who'd done this before. He placed the baby in a basket beside the fire, wrapped her in another layer, and then knelt beside Midnight, who had collapsed just inside the door. The stallion was breathing heavily, blood staining his side. The man ran a hand over the wound and stopped at the hoof. "You've been carrying sin again," he said to the horse. Midnight exhaled, hard eyes watching him. There was no fear between them, only memory. "You always come back." The man stood slowly, reaching for a tin basin and a small iron box. Emily stirred. Her voice cracked. Who are you?" He didn't turn. "Name's Jeremiah," he said. "I used to be someone. Now I just fix what limps and feed what starves." She tried to sit up but couldn't. The warmth had unlocked the pain in her bones. Her hands shook as she reached toward Lily. "She's okay," he said, already mixing something in the basin. "Cold, but strong." "You're the one near the edge." Emily looked around. The walls were lined with tools, herbs hanging from the beams, pelts drying near the chimney. A rifle rested above the door dust, blanketing its barrel. And above the hearth, framed by bone, a cross split clean in half. He returned to the horse with the basin. "What is this place?" she asked, teeth still clicking. Jeremiah dipped a cloth into the warm mixture and began cleaning Midnight's wound. "A mistake," he said. Midnight flinched, but didn't move away. "Used to be a trapper's lodge. Then it was a sanctuary. Then it was mine." His hands worked with quiet precision, packing the wound with herbs. But Emily could see them shaking. Not from age, something else. A tension just beneath the skin. "You know this horse?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. "Then I knew the one who trained him." Emily watched the old man work the firelight, painting his face in deep shadows. "Why did you help me?" Jeremiah paused. He set the cloth down and finally turned to face her. "You came from the South Ridge," he said. "With a baby. And that horse. In the snow." He stepped forward slowly. His eyes, though milk-white, locked on hers, like they could still see something beneath skin and speech. "You don't just stumble here," he said. "You're sent." Emily swallowed. "I wasn't sent. I was running." He shook his head once. "No. No one runs toward this place." Silence settled again. Then from the corner, Lily made a small sound. Jeremiah's head turned sharply toward the sound. "She sounds like her," he said under his breath. Emily sat up, ignoring the scream in her back. "Who?" He didn't reply. Instead, he reached into the cabinet and pulled out an old hoof knife. "Rest," he said, moving to Midnight again. "I got something to do." He worked in silence for an hour. Emily watched. Jeremiah knelt beside the stallion, his hands moving with the reverence of ritual. He scraped and filed, trimmed and smoothed. Midnight barely flinched, as if he remembered those hands, trusted them. At one point, Jeremiah paused. His hand trembled as he rested it against the horse's leg. "I failed him," he whispered. "I failed all of them." His voice cracked like something rusted too long, finally breaking. Emily sat in silence. He didn't speak again until he was done. He stood, walked to the hearth, and stared into the flame. "You know Dax?" he asked. Emily tensed. "Yes," she said. His shoulders dropped. "I was his right hand once," he said. Emily stared. Jeremiah continued, voice flat. "Before the badge. Before the blood." He didn't look at her. "We called it a calling. Said we were chosen. He found things buried in the mountain, things that spoke when no one else could hear. He called it power. I called it God." He finally turned, but it was neither. It was hunger. Emily's breath caught in her chest. "I didn't know," she said. He smiled, but it was broken. "No one does. Not until it's too late." He walked to a corner, knelt, and opened a small box. Inside were objects Emily didn't recognize. Symbols carved into bone, a child's shoe, a faded ribbon. He held one up. "She was 6, he said. Bright eyes, strong legs, laughed like thunder." Emily's throat tightened. Dax said she was chosen. Said her light would open the gate. Said I'd see her again on the other side. He dropped the shoe back into the box. She screamed until the end. Silence pressed against the walls. Emily stood. Her legs shook. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jeremiah didn't answer. He walked to Midnight and placed a hand on the stallion's neck. "That flame you're chasing," he said. "The ember." Emily nodded slowly. "James, my husband, he believed in it. Jeremiah's face twisted. That fire doesn't save, he said. It burns. He turned back to the hearth. It doesn't care who you are, only what you carry. Emily looked at Lily, still sleeping in the basket, her tiny chest rising and falling. I'm not asking it to save me, she said. Only her. Jeremiah stared into the flames. Then you'll need more than belief. Later, after the baby was fed and Emily had wrapped her feet in fur, Jeremiah returned to the stallion with a final bottle, a salve thick as pitch, reeking of smoke and pine. He knelt. Midnight looked at him. Jeremiah's hand trembled as it pressed against the wound. His voice cracked. You came back, after all this time? His other hand stroked Midnight's mane. I see her in your eyes, her fire. A tear ran down his cheek and fell into the salve. He didn't wipe it away. I won't fail again, he whispered. I won't. Night had grown thick inside the cabin, heavy as wool. Outside, the wind clawed the mountains with bony fingers, but the stone walls held. For now. Inside, the fire in the hearth had dimmed no longer, blazing only breathing a faint flickering glow that painted the room in long shadows and soft betrayal. Emily sat on the floor beside Lily's basket. Her legs folded beneath her like paper. Her fingers twitched absently in her lap, caked with old blood and dried milk. Her eyes stared into the fire, but she didn't see the flame. She saw iron, hot iron, sparks flying, smoke that clung to skin. And James, he stood in the workshop, shirtless, sweat gleaming across his back despite the Wyoming cold seeping through the cracked window. In his hand, a hammer. In the other, a red-hot horseshoe clamped between tongs. The forge behind him glowed like a dragon's eye, and he moved through it like he was part of it, half man, half fire. Emily stood in the doorway, one hand on her swelling belly. You ever think about naming her? She asked, teasing. James didn't answer immediately. He plunged the horseshoe into the bucket of water beside him, and the hiss curled around the room like steam-shaped music. Then he turned. I'm making something for her. She laughed. A horseshoe. A soul frame, he said, serious now. She raised an eyebrow. He came to her slowly, one sooty hand reaching to rest gently over her belly. She's coming into a world colder than steel, he murmured. But you're heat. You're fire. You're going to be her forge. His voice caught for just a second. You'll be the first place her soul ever takes shape. The anvil, the bellows, the flame. Before the world gets its hammer in. Emily stared at him. Her throat tightened. He bent down, kissed the curve of her stomach, and whispered, You're the first forge. The fire cracked into the present. Emily blinked. Her mouth was dry. Her lips were trembling. She looked down at Lily, sleeping wrapped in furs and quiet for once. Not cold anymore. Just silent. Emily reached out her hand, hovering above the baby's chest, not quite touching. She waited to feel breath. To count. In, out, in, out. Still alive. Still here. So why did it feel like everything inside her was breaking? She swallowed the ache rising in her throat. But it didn't go down. It swelled. It swelled until it pressed against her teeth, against her ribs, against the very edges of her skin. She stood unsteady and moved to the wall where her coat still hung drenched in blood and soot. She touched it. Not to wear it, just to remember the weight. She whispered into the stone of the wall, I'm not a good mother. The words died the moment they left her mouth. The fire didn't flicker. The room didn't react. But her voice found a rhythm, a dark, inevitable song. I didn't fight hard enough. Not when they came. Not when James. Her jaw clenched. I just froze. She pressed her back against the wall and let her knees give out, sliding to the floor in a heap. I don't even know where I'm going. Ember Ridge. That's a story. That's just ink on paper and dreams James wouldn't let go of. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I just want to live. The shame of it sat heavy on her chest. I don't want to be noble. I don't want to carry the flame. I just want to survive. She laughed, but there was nothing light in it. I'd give her away if it meant we both lived. She looked over at Lily, but I can't. Because she's all that's left. And if I lose her, it won't matter if I live or die. The silence after that was unbearable. Emily stood and stumbled to the hearth. She picked up the iron poker and stirred the fire, but it was mostly coals now. The flame whimpered, barely clinging to the wood. Its light painted only her face now, and even that dimly. She crouched, arm resting on her knee, and stared into the embers. Jeremiah was sleeping in the other room, or pretending to. Midnight lay curled on the far side of the hearth, his flank rising and falling slowly, a deep sigh rising from his chest, like old grief. Emily looked at the stallion. You carried us farther than I deserved. Midnight's tail twitched. Then he lifted his head. They locked eyes. It only lasted a moment, but something passed between them. Not words, recognition. Then quietly, impossibly gently, Midnight moved. His hooves made no sound on the dirt floor as he stepped beside Lily's basket. He lowered himself to the ground, with slow, deliberate care, and he curled his body around the sleeping child. Emily watched, frozen. His long tail stretched, flicking once, then settling lightly over the side of the basket, like a curtain. Emily didn't breathe. Midnight exhaled his breath, brushing Lily's cheek. Then stillness. The only sound was the soft crackle of the last ember in the hearth. Emily turned back toward the fire. Her reflection in the iron poker glowed with a faint copper hue. Her hair, once golden, now matted with soot and sweat, caught the ember light. There, just at the ends, faint flickers of red. Fire buried in ash. She stared at it. A memory sparked unbidden. James, hammer in hand, his voice echoing like prophecy. "You'll be the forge." She bit her lip until it bled. Then she whispered so softly, the mountain itself would have to lean in to hear. "I'm still here." No thunder followed. No miracle flame. Just a tired mother, a sleeping child, a wounded horse, and a fire trying not to die. And for now, that was enough. The snow had turned to ash again. Emily pulled the coat tighter around Lily, shielding the baby from the wind that no longer howled. It whispered now. Low, bone deep. Like something buried far beneath the rock was waking up slowly. She walked with her head down, each step heavier than the last, until the trail disappeared entirely, and the wind became a wall. She looked up, before her a cliff face broken and jagged like teeth. She squinted. There between two slabs of stone was a slit in the rock, narrow and dark, half hidden by snow and time. Not a path. Not a tunnel. A mouth. Midnight stopped behind her and snorted once. Not fear, a warning. Emily hesitated, then looked down at Lily asleep, now her lips parted in soft breath. "I know," she whispered. "But there's nowhere else." She turned sideways and stepped into the stone. The darkness swallowed her. The passage narrowed, then opened suddenly. The air changed warmer, laced with minerals and something older than earth. The walls pulsed with veins of red rock and crystals that shimmered faintly, as if lit from within. The deeper she moved, the more the light behind her disappeared. Midnight's steps echoed behind her, hoof on rock, soft, uncertain. Then they stopped. Emily turned. The stallion was standing still, ears pricked forward, watching something she couldn't see. Then she heard it. A low growl, not threatening, not angry, but firm, present. From the far end of the chamber, a pair of eyes blinked open in the dark. Amber. A shape moved limping into the faint light. A wolf. Gray, massive, with a missing foreleg. It moved with surprising grace, despite its wounds circling once, before lying down near the wall, eyes never leaving them. Emily stepped slowly forward, heart pounding. Then another sound, a shuffle, small feet on stone. A figure emerged behind the wolf. A boy, no more than 10. Thin, dressed in layers of patchwork cloth and fur stitched by hand. His face was hollowed by hunger, but his eyes, they burned. Same as the wolf, same as the coals. He stared at Emily. She opened her mouth to speak. He lifted one finger, sharply pressing it to his lips. Then a gesture. Palm open, held to her chest. She froze. Another sign, both hands raised, fingers curved, pressed together, then released like wings. A name. She watched him repeat the motion. Then he pointed to himself. Emily knelt slowly, careful not to startle him. Lily stirred in her arms. The boy's eyes lit up. He stepped closer, reaching out gently, not for Emily, but for Lily. His hand hovered above the baby's cheek, then pulled back quickly. He gestured again. Palm to heart, wings. Emily hesitated, then whispered, "Your name is..." "Noah." He smiled, nodded hard, then ran to the wall and began pulling stones aside. Behind them, a smooth slab of rock. With careful, practiced hands, he picked up a piece of chalky stone and began to draw. Lines, circles, mountains, fire. It took shape slowly. A map. Emily stared. The central image of flame surrounded by waves glowed faintly. Not paint. Not chalk. Something else. Etched into the wall itself, maybe centuries old. Noah gestured to it, then to Emily, then mimed rocking a baby in his arms. She blinked. "You mean me?" He nodded again, more slowly this time, then tapped the flame. A long pause. Then two hands over his chest. A breath. Emily's voice cracked. "You're saying I'm the mother of flame?" Noah didn't speak. He couldn't, but his silence said more than words. They stayed the night inside the cavern. It wasn't a home, but it had been made into one. Furs lined the floor. A spring trickled from a crevice, warm and mineral-rich. The wolf, who Noah called only with a low whistle, lay curled near the wall, snoring lightly. Emily fed Lily what little was left. She offered Noah a piece of dry bread from her pack. He took it, bowed his head, then tore it in half and shared it with the wolf. Later, as the fire they built from dry moss and bone-dry twigs warmed the room, Noah began to draw again, this time not on the wall, but in the dirt. He drew a figure, a woman, curved lines, hair like fire. Then he added a second, a child. Then above them both, he drew a flame. Not upright, upside down. Emily pointed at it. "What is that?" Noah tilted his head. Then, using only gestures and his whole body, he mimed something extraordinary. He crouched, hands curled into fists over his chest. He shook them, pain fear. Then he slowly opened them, fingers fluttering upward like smoke. He stood, back straight, eyes lifted, then turned his palms downward and mimed planting something. Fire into earth. Emily gasped. You're saying it's not just a story? Noah nodded. It's a seed. He nodded again. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with wind. Noah walked to the back wall of the cave and with slow reverence lifted a flap of fur that had been nailed over a crevice. Behind it, a narrow tunnel sloping steeply downward. Steam rose from it. Noah pointed, then gestured again, a downward motion, then cupped hands over his ears. Danger. Emily approached carefully. She peered into the tunnel. It glowed red, dimly. Far below, lava. She stepped back. Noah made another sign. Across with his arms, then mimed walking. Through it. He nodded once. Is it the only way? He nodded again, slower this time. Her heart sank. She looked back at Lily, at midnight, at the wolf who now watched her with eyes like ancient moons. Then she nodded. Show me. Noah moved like someone born of stone and fire. He led them through the crevice, crouching low, always touching the walls with both hands. Emily followed, cradling Lily, sweat already dripping from her neck. The heat here wasn't unbearable, but it was thick. Alive. The tunnel narrowed, then opened suddenly into a wide chamber. Below, a river of molten rock moving slow and thick. The ceiling above pulsed orange, lit only by the lava. A single path led across, narrow. Stone slabs suspended between points, some crumbling at the edges. Noah turned to her, held out his hand. Emily looked down at it. Small, dirty, scarred. She took it, and they crossed, step by step. Twice Emily slipped. Once she nearly dropped Lily. Midnight stepped with eerie, calm hooves, finding perfect holds, as if guided by memory. The wolf limped behind them, always watching, always listening. Noah didn't look back. He only looked forward, eyes on the far wall, on the sigil carved there, lit by lava. A spiral, a flame, and beneath it carved into stone. She who carries fire does not burn. She becomes light. Emily stopped, stared at the words. Noah turned, smiled faintly. And for the first time, she understood. Not through words, not even through thought, but through presence, through feeling. This boy, silent and alone, had taught her more in hours than any preacher or soldier or map ever could. Not everything needed to be spoken. Not everything should. She looked down at Lily. The baby stirred. Emily smiled, not because the path ahead was safe, but because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't walking it alone. The wind had stopped screaming. That was the first warning. Emily stood at the edge of the cave, mouth arms wrapped around Lily. Her breath caught in the stillness. Midnight shifted beside her, his ears flicking backward. A muscle in his flank tensed. Behind them, Noah crouched beside the three-legged wolf, fingers resting gently on its shoulder. Even the beast was quiet now. Too quiet. The mountain no longer groaned. The lava no longer hummed. Silence. And then, a crack. Stone against steel. The sound of boots on rock. Voices. Emily turned fast, instinct flaring up in her spine like flame. Too late. A figure stepped from the shadows, silhouetted by the fading ember glow. Sheriff Dax. And behind him, three riders' faces masked in soot eyes, hollow rifles drawn. One held Noah in a tight grip, a crude knife pressed to the boy's neck. Noah struggled, but he didn't cry out. He couldn't. Emily's heart stuttered. Dax smiled. There was nothing warm in it. Nothing even human. It was the curl of a predator that enjoyed the kill before the blood. Well, now he drawled, eyes gleaming. A family reunion. Emily stepped in front of Lily by instinct, one hand gripping the child close to her chest. Dax raised a hand as if to say easy now. Then he turned to the boy. Found your friend wandering too close to the smoke tunnels? Poor thing couldn't scream for help, could he? Noah stared back at him, unblinking. Dax's voice dropped to a purr. Don't worry. He'll keep breathing. All you have to do is hand over what belongs to the flame. He pointed a gloved finger at Lily. Emily didn't answer. The riders flanked her, forming a crescent around the cavern ledge. The lava river below pulsed faintly, but its warmth felt 1,000 miles away. Dax stepped closer. It's not personal, he whispered. It never was. You and I were just instruments, but he pointed again at the infant. She's the door. Emily's voice came out raw. You don't believe in doors? You only believe in control. Dax's smile widened. You're wrong. I believe in what works. He turned his head, slowly glancing at Noah, then back to Emily. So here's what's going to happen. You'll place the child on the stone behind you. Then we'll let the mute go. He can scamper back to the woods with his dog. No worse for wear. Noah's eyes flicked to hers, wide, terrified, silent. The blade pressed harder against his neck. A single bead of blood bloomed along his throat. Emily's knees nearly gave. 2 children, 1 soul, 1 fire. She looked down at Lily, sleeping, peaceful, unaware. The baby didn't know the world wanted to consume her. She just knew warmth in arms and a heartbeat she trusted. Emily's. And then she looked at Noah, the boy who had given her bread. who had shown her the fire map, who had taught her to listen without words. What kind of mother would trade one child for another? But what kind of monster would let both die? Her breath caught in her throat. The firelight flickered behind her eyes. Dax saw the hesitation. He stepped closer. "I know what you're thinking," he said, almost tender now. "And I respect it. I do. You've come far. Farther than I thought you would." He nodded toward Midnight. "Hell, you even brought that ghost with you. That's impressive." Emily didn't move. The weight of the decision crushed every inch of her. Dax whispered, "Be a survivor, not a martyr." She looked at Noah again, then down at Lily. Her eyes closed, then opened slowly. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "All right." Dax's eyes lit. She took a single step forward. Midnight growled low, but she silenced him with a glance. Emily stepped towards the stone ledge. She bent slightly as if preparing to place Lily on the flat surface behind her. Dax moved forward eagerly, arms already half outstretched. Emily's fingers reached to her waist, where a thin strip of iron sharpened from Midnight's tack lay hidden beneath her coat. In one motion, she thrust forward, the blade buried deep into Dax's left hand. He roared, staggering back. Blood sprayed against the rock. In the chaos, Midnight surged forward, rearing up with a scream. His hooves struck one of the riders full in the chest, hurling him against the wall. Another fired missed. Noah dropped to the ground and rolled away, the wolf leaping forward with a snarl, tearing into the third man's leg. Emily turned to grab Lily, only to see Dax already lunging. His face was a mask of rage, his knife out, his wound forgotten. He was moving too fast. And then Midnight moved. The stallion turned sharply, placing himself between Dax and the child. Dax's blade drove deep into the horse's shoulder. Midnight screamed. His body jerked. Blood poured onto the stone. Emily cried out. Noah froze. And then everything shifted. Where Midnight's blood touched the cavern floor, the rock began to glow. Not orange, not red, white. It pulsed once, twice, then erupted in light. A path began to form. From beneath the blood-soaked stone, a symbol carved itself in living flame. A spiral, an eye, a door. Dax staggered back, shielding his face from the heat. "What the hell?" he gasped. Midnight collapsed to one knee, but did not fall. Emily held Lily tightly. The air filled with a sound that was not a sound at all. A hum, a memory, a heartbeat that had waited too long. And then the wall behind them cracked. Stone shifted. The mountain opened. A tunnel, dark and warm and alive, yawned wide from the heart of the cliff. The entrance to Ember. Midnight turned his head, blood streaming from his mouth, and locked eyes with Emily. She understood. No words, just knowing. He had made it. The door was open. Dax screamed again, charging toward her. But this time, Noah stood in front of him, a stone in his hand. The boy didn't speak. He didn't need to. He threw the rock. It struck Dax square in the temple. He stumbled, reeled, then fell. The wolf lunged and sank its teeth into his arm. Emily didn't wait. She scooped up Noah with one hand, Lily in the other, and turned toward the light. Midnight stood behind them, blood still pouring, muscles trembling. But he didn't follow. He simply turned, faced the men behind, and waited. Emily looked back once. The stallion met her gaze. "Goodbye." Then she disappeared into the tunnel, 2 children in her arms, and the fire sealed behind her. The tunnel breathed. Emily felt it in her chest. Not air, not wind, but something deeper. A pulse like the ribs of the mountain, were alive like the very rock around her, remembered. Her boots scraped over the blackened stone, still slick with Midnight's blood. Behind her, the light pulsed red, then gold, then white. It wasn't just a path. It was a transition. She stepped forward. In her arms, Lily stirred as if sensing the shift. Noah walked at her side, silent, small fingers brushing the hem of her coat. The wolf limped behind him, cautious but loyal. They passed into the narrowing walls, deeper and deeper, until the ceiling above them vanished. And the world opened. The chamber beyond was colossal, a cathedral carved not by men, but by time and fire. Stalactites hung like the teeth of gods. Rivers of molten light twisted through the cracks, not falling downward, but upward. Flames flowing in reverse, curling toward a sky they could never reach. Above it all, a veil of black mist swirling in slow motion. Soot. Memory. Smoke. And in the center of it all, resting atop a stone platform shaped like a cupped hand, was the ember, or what she believed must be it. A flame that did not burn. It hovered, silent, glowing with a color she could not name. It looked like gold before memory, or the light at the end of grief. Not fire, not entirely. Something older, something waiting. Emily stepped forward, knees trembling. Her breath misted even here, even in the heat. Midnight followed. Each step was agony for him now. His side was soaked in blood, black as ink under the firelight. He limped heavily, his legs buckling once, nearly collapsing, but he kept going. The stone bridge to the ember lay before them, framed by curling walls of magma. It was narrow, rising in a slow curve like the arch of a spine. Emily's breath caught as she placed a foot on it. The rock was warm beneath her boots. Not burning, just alive. She reached the center. The platform waited. She knelt slowly, painfully, and placed Lily upon the altar. The child stirred, a small cry escaping her lips. But as her skin touched the stone, light bloomed. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't violent. It was quiet. A soft exhale from the universe. The flame lifted from its cradle and hovered above Lily, pulsing gently. Golden threads of light reached down, not flames, not heat. Threads. Like memory, like love, like music you remember from the womb. They wrapped gently around the child, not binding her, but surrounding her. Protecting. Emily knelt back, hands trembling. Noah stood beside her, staring wide-eyed. Then the mountain shook. A sound thundered behind them. Emily turned. Dax, his coat in tatters, his eyes bloodshot ash smeared across his face like war paint. He stumbled into the chamber, a rifle in one hand, the other dragging a burning torch. Behind him, the cave's molten veins began to hiss, disturbed by his presence. He saw the platform. The flame. Emily. He roared. No. He charged. Emily stepped forward, arms wide. Stay back. But the flame didn't stop him. It didn't move. It only hovered above the child, as if waiting. Dax sprinted across the stone bridge. But the moment he reached the midpoint, the magma surged. It leapt. Like a living thing, a wave of molten rock rose from the depths, not to swallow him, but to block him. The fire moved against its nature. Dax skidded to a halt. He snarled. He raised his rifle. A shot rang out. The bullet struck the side of the platform, but the ember did not flicker. Lily did not cry. The light simply absorbed the force, silenced it. Dax screamed in frustration. Behind him, a sound. Hooves. Dragging. Emily turned. Midnight. His legs shaking, his head low, but he kept walking, toward the edge of the lava. Emily moved toward him, but he shook his head once firm, final. Then he turned to face her fully, and stopped. His eyes found hers, and she understood. He looked at the platform, then at her, then at Lily. Emily fell to her knees. No, she whispered. But he had already turned, one step, then another, toward the edge, toward the flame. His body bled with every movement. His breathing labored. He limped, staggered, but did not fall. Then with one final burst of strength, he leapt, straight into the molten river. Emily screamed. Noah gasped. The wolf howled. And then, silence, until the fire shifted. It did not consume him. It rose around him. It curled slowly, reverently, like a cloak. It lifted him, in slow motion. Midnight's body did not vanish. It glowed. The flames twined through his mane, danced along his spine. The blood that poured from him was caught in the light and transformed, not lost, absorbed. His body rose higher, suspended in the air, a shape outlined by gold and grief and honor. Then one by one the flames curled inward, folding over him. A cocoon, a shroud, a tomb made of light. And when the last curl of fire kissed the air, he was gone. But the ember, now fully awakened, burned brighter than ever. It pulsed once. And from beneath the platform the mountain opened again. A new path, steps shaped like roots leading downward, into the heart of Ember, the true heart, where no evil could follow. Emily collapsed to the stone. Tears fell freely down her cheeks. But they did not burn. Noah knelt beside her. The wolf pressed against her side. And above them, Lily opened her eyes for the first time. Not in fear, but in light. Emily whispered through the sobs to no one and to everything. He chose. And the ember answered, not with words, but with warmth. The wind had changed. It no longer howled or whispered. It breathed. Emily stepped through the flame-split archway carved into the heart of the mountain, Lily cradled to her chest. Behind her, Noah walked barefoot, soot still smudged across his cheeks, eyes wide with a kind of awe only silence can shape. The wolf limped at his side like a shadow that had chosen to stay. The world they entered wasn't made of stone. It was made of memory. Caverns opened into wide terraces, bathed in amber-glow warmth that did not burn, but held. From the ceiling dripped long stalactites, shaped like fingers, reaching down, some wrapped in woven cloths, others etched with ancient spirals. Paths wove through molten streams and soft moss underfoot, where nothing grew, yet nothing died. And then they appeared, from the glow. People, dozens, maybe more. Faces marked by firelight, skin sun-kissed and shadow-worn. They stepped silently from behind crystal-lit walls and crevices, as if born of the stone itself. Their eyes held stories, generations, and something even older, recognition. Emily stopped. No one spoke. Then one woman stepped forward. Hair streaked with silver, arms strong, her chest wrapped in dark cloth and leather. Across her collarbone, a black tattoo shimmered lines, like flame curled into the palm of an open hand. "The fire that chooses," she said softly, her voice dust and steel. She looked down at Lily, who stirred, blinking up at the glow. Then she met Emily's eyes. "You carried her through ash." Emily tried to answer, but the words caught in her throat. The woman stepped closer, placing one hand gently over Emily's heart. Her palm was hot, not burning, but radiating warmth from somewhere beyond flesh. "You are the anvil. You are the bellows. You are the forge. She turned slightly and spoke not loudly, but it echoed. She is the forge mother. A murmur rose around them, soft as wind over coals. Forge mother. Emily's breath hitched. A man stepped forward, his hands scarred black lines of ink coiled over his fingers and wrists. He held a cloth dark crimson embroidered with a spiral of fire. Slowly, reverently, he draped it over Emily's shoulders. Another woman brought a carved bowl of water that shimmered like melted gold. She dipped her fingers, then touched Emily's brow. Then Lily's, then Noah's. They made no demands, no chants, only silence, respectful, deep, a stillness that honored. And then one by one, the others stepped forward, men, women, children, and showed their palms, tattooed. Each bore the mark, the flame inside the open hand. They held them out, not to threaten, but to welcome. Emily bowed her head, not because she felt worthy, but because she understood the weight of being received. That night, they gathered around the ember pit, a circle of glass like stone, where fire did not roar, but sing. The light shimmered in different colors, with each breath of the wind. Instruments appeared, hollow bone flutes, drums skinned from beasts, long-vanished bells made of stone. They did not perform. They remembered. One elder began a slow chant. Not words, not language, but tone. Then another joined. Then more. Noah sat at the edge of the circle, knees pulled to his chest, arms around the wolf. His eyes stared into the fire. Emily sat nearby Lily, asleep in a sling wrapped tight against her body. Noah turned toward her, and something shifted in him. He opened his mouth. Tried once. No sound. He closed it, breathed, then opened again. Ember. It came out rough, broken. But it came. Emily's eyes widened. Her breath caught. The elder closest to him turned. Others paused. Noah's hand went to his chest. He repeated stronger this time. Ember. The flames pulsed. No one clapped. No one wept. But something sacred had just occurred. A boy born into silence had spoken. And the mountain heard. Later, as the fire dimmed and the others drifted into sleep among the stones, Emily sat alone beside the pool where golden water trickled from beneath a glowing root. She looked down at Lily. I'm not who you need me to be, she whispered. But maybe I'm becoming her. She closed her eyes. I was a woman who wanted only to live. She touched the child's hand. Now I think I'm something else. She didn't finish the thought, because behind her near the edge of shadow, someone stood. Emily turned. Jeremiah, his form outlined by the glow of the lava threads running down the wall. His coat was dusted in ash, his beard tangled with snowmelt. His hands trembled. The wolf at Noah's side lifted its head slightly, then lowered it again. Jeremiah did not step forward. He just watched. His eyes, those cataract-white orbs, shone wet. Emily stood slowly. She didn't speak. He didn't move. And then, a tear ran down his cheek. The man who had lost his child, who had carried guilt like a second spine. He reached up briefly, as if to speak, to explain, to beg, but then let the hand fall. He turned and began to walk away. The wolf joined him, pressing its body into his leg. They disappeared into the shadow between the stones. Emily did not call him back. She only whispered into the dark, "You brought us here." And the fire pulsed once in acknowledgement. The light inside the ember hollow had changed. It no longer pulsed with danger or prophecy. It flickered softly now, like memory taking form. In the upper chamber where the stone was smoothest and the heat from below gentlest, the children of the Ember clan gathered in a semicircle, cross-legged, silent. Their faces glowed amber in the firelight. They waited. At the center of the circle, Emily crouched. A bowl of coal ash and oil sat beside her, and in her hand a smooth shard of blackened stone sharpened to a point. The cavern wall behind her was bare her canvas. Lily slept swaddled against her chest. Breath warm and steady, Noah sat close to the children, eyes focused on her hands, while the wolf lay behind him, tail curled tight around its body, silent sentinel. Emily dipped the stone in ash and turned to the wall. Her first line was a curve, a sweeping motion like a spiral carved into the air. Then a smaller flame inside that curve. Then 4 legs, a tail, a horse. She worked silently, swiftly, the way someone does when the story is no longer a tale, but a remembering. With every stroke, the wall came alive, the forge back in Wyoming, the bandits, the snow. Her strokes grew sharper. Dax's eyes, the rifle, the scream in the cold. Then the stallion, midnight drawn not as a beast, but as a symbol. No bridle, no rider, just light wrapped in muscle and purpose. Then she turned. Her hands moved differently now, not to draw, but to speak. She had learned the clan signs quickly, and what she didn't know she created. This, she gestured palm open, sweeping around the room, is not my story. It is his, she pointed to the painted horse, then to her chest. I was only the one who listened. The children leaned forward. One small girl mimicked the shape of a flame in her palm. Another boy signed Fire Horse with 2 flicks of his fingers. Emily nodded, encouraged. Then she touched the edge of the horse drawing again. Midnight was not only a horse. She drew a swirl in the air, a long, slow breath, and placed her hand over her heart. He was a memory. She pointed at Noah. He was a bridge. She touched her own lips, then Lily's brow. He was a soul sent back. She hesitated, then added, by James. She drew his name with care, H.A., formed with 2 fingers crossing the chest. The children were silent, not out of confusion, out of reverence. Noah stood slowly. He stepped toward the wall, dipped his fingers into the ash, and added a symbol beside the horse, a flame rising from a hand. He stepped back, and for the first time since they'd met, Emily saw not a child surviving, but a child remembering. He looked to her, then signed slowly. He saw us. She smiled, her eyes filled. Yes. At twilight, the village gathered, not around a funeral pyre, not with drums or wailing, but at the river of light that coiled through the caverns, the ember stream where the lava flowed silent and slow, as if morning required no sound. It was said to be the last breath of the mountain's first fire. A place where memory did not burn, but transformed. A platform had been built of blackened wood and hollow bones shaped like the ribs of a sleeping creature. Upon it, a simple urn. No markings, no name, only ash. Emily stood at its edge, facing the tribe. The Forge Mother. She wore a cloak of woven fire threads sewn from silk spun near the ember's core. On her palms, burned into her skin, not by ink but by ritual, was the mark flame in the open hand. Beside her stood Noah, holding a carved torch. When he passed it to her, he signed with a trembling hand, "Let him ride." She nodded, then stepped to the urn. Her voice came steady, soft, but fierce. Midnight was not just my companion. She looked out over the glowing eyes around her. He was my witness, my mirror, my memory of the man I loved, and the man I became after him. She paused. His silence never meant absence. It meant presence so deep words would have insulted it. She bent and touched the edge of the urn, then lit the torch. The flame flickered once gold-white, then caught. Ash leapt. The fire rose in a slow pillar, no smoke, no wind. Just light climbing, stretching. Then it shaped. Gasps echoed. From the fire rising above them, all emerged a form. Not perfect, not literal, but unmistakable. A horse flaming, galloping not across land, across sky. His mane flowed like river-born fire. His hooves struck no earth, but he moved one leg after another across the invisible path above their heads. A sculpture of farewell etched in pure light. Children pointed. Elders wept. One woman fell to her knees, whispering prayers in a tongue long buried. Emily stood frozen. She saw it. Not just the horse, but James' hands, still soot-stained eyes, alight with pride somewhere in that shape. Midnight was carrying more than her pain. He was carrying her becoming. The fire arced one last time, then slowly unraveled, not vanishing, but folding into stars. The cavern returned to stillness, and in the glow that remained, Emily whispered, "He will never burn." He was the flame, and in the hearts of all who watched, he still was. 5 winters had passed since the mountain first opened its throat and sang fire into the dark. The ember had cooled into something deeper than flame memory ritual legacy, and the forge had never gone silent. In the heart of the cavern, beneath the braided roots of obsidian, a hammer struck iron. Rhythmic, certain, not rushed, not harsh, intentional. The girl wielding it was no longer a child. Lily, now nearly 6 hands wrapped in leather arms dusted in ash and hair, a flame of its own, thick, curling copper red catching the ember light like strands of living fire. She wore a smock sewn from hide boots too large and an apron twice mended. But her eyes were steady. Emily stood at the doorway, watching her daughter work. She didn't interfere. She hadn't for weeks now. She simply stood and listened. The metal hissed in water. The girl smiled. The village had grown, not wider but deeper. Tunnels once sealed were now homes. Chambers once hollow now rang with children's laughter and the iron-sharp rhythm of growth. And the people, no longer only descendants of ember blood, had become many. Mothers, they came first. From the north, the coasts, the edge of deserts. Some pregnant, some carrying toddlers, some barefoot, some scarred, all of them carrying stories they could no longer hold alone. Emily welcomed them herself. No questions, no creeds, only a basin of golden water and the mark of fire in an open palm. The Forge of Souls, as the new mothers called it, was never locked. No gates, no guards, only warmth, and a bell that told not to warn, but to welcome. By the entrance to the forge, inside a chamber that faced the longest ember stream, stood a shelf. On it books, not many, each bound by hand, spine stitched with gold-touched thread. At the center, a single black volume. Worn edges smoothed by fingers, its cover etched with the symbol of a flame coiled inside an eye. Its title, The Last Ember. Beneath it the name Emily Grace, and smaller still in script, formed by someone teaching themselves to believe again. For those who choose to carry the fire, not because they are strong, but because they remember. The story spread beyond the mountain, passed from palm to palm. Sometimes whispered, sometimes read aloud beside dwindling fires in frost-bitten towns. Sometimes carried like scripture, but always returned, because it was never hers to own. It belonged to all who had walked through ash, and chosen not to become it. On the 5th anniversary of Midnight's death, the sky above the mountain opened, not with fire, with snow. It came soft and slow, blanketing the peaks in silence. Lily stood at the edge of the overlook, a cloak draped around her shoulders, a satchel strapped across her chest, and fire in her hand, literally. A stone of compressed ember glowing faint orange in a glass pendant. Her fingers wrapped around it like instinct. Beside her snorted a young horse, jet black, slender tall. Its mane shimmered red in the snow light, each strand catching light like threads of blood and brass. The creature moved restlessly eager, but obedient. Lily reached up, touching its jaw gently. The horse nuzzled her breath, steaming into the air. She signed to it a gesture she had learned from Noah, now a quiet young man who taught children how to speak without voice. The sign meant, "Ready." The horse stamped once. Emily approached quietly. Her face was older now, lines drawn deep around the eyes. But the fire hadn't left. It had just settled into her bones like iron cooled to shape. "You know you don't have to go," she said. Lily turned. "I know." Emily reached into her coat and pulled something out, a piece of dark cloth folded neatly. She unfolded it slowly. It was the saddle flag of Midnight. The threads had faded, but the flame inside hand still glowed faintly dyed from the first ceremony. Lily took it in both hands, pressed it to her heart, then tied it to her saddle horn. Emily stepped forward and kissed her daughter's brow, then whispered, "Ride like memory." Lily smiled. "Ride like soul," she answered. She turned, mounted the horse in one fluid motion, and turned toward the open snowpath. The villagers stood at a distance, not in silence, not weeping, but watching, witnessing, as she kicked gently once, and the horse began to trot, then canter, then run hoofbeats, striking snow not with thunder, but with intention. And the last image, Lily, hair trailing like fire behind her, the ember stone glowing in her palm, the black-red horse cutting through snow, a girl with flame in her blood and memory in her saddle, riding into the night, not to flee it, but to light it. The screen fades to black. A final line appears etched in silver flame. The last ember is not behind us. It rides ahead.